Welcome to the Green Mr. Rogers. I'm Ryan McDermott. I'm the faculty director of Beatrice Institute, and I'm also an English professor at the University of Pittsburgh. This event is generously co-sponsored by Central Catholic High School and the Bruderhof communities. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from two co-authors of a book that they have been working on together, The Green Mr. Rogers. Sara Lindey and Jason King are both professors at St. Vincent College. Dr. Lindey is a professor of English, and Dr. King is a professor of theology, so they make up a perfect team for this particular kind of book. The format for the evening is a co-presentation by Professors Lindey and King, followed by Q&A. Now we have both a Q&A dialogue and a chat. And so you have the option of participating in either or both of those. If you want to ask a question that I will address to our co-presenters, please type it in the Q&A. If you want to just chime in with a comment or a reading recommendation, please type that into the chat. If you accidentally type a question into the chat, I will probably find it and still bring it to our presenters' attention. But so you can be typing questions in the Q&A while they present, and then we will have about 30 minutes of open conversation at the end. All right, so now I will turn it over to Sara Lindey.
Thank you, Ryan. I want to say thank you to the Beatrice Institute for having us. John Buckman attempted to organize this event about a year ago and has kept in touch with us and passed it on to Ryan McDermott. So thank you to both of you and everyone at the Beatrice Institute for inviting us. For those of you who came here via Fred, I've been learning a little bit more about the Beatrice Institute, and it's pretty cool. Today I listened to the podcast that Elise Lunich Ryan, her interview with Marilyn McIntyre. She's a poet and a medical humanities scholar, and it's about like the intentionality of words and the worlds that words contain. It was awesome, and I'm still dwelling in it, and those are jokes about the podcast if you have to listen to it. And I also want to say that Fred would have loved the divine cosmic artist that Kirsten Barron's song celebrates. That podcast is so great, and the enthusiasm for the song is gentle and it's thrilling. And as I impatiently wait for spring, Kirsten reminds us that the ivy is always green. So thank you for your work. The people at the Beatrice Institute, and Jason and I are really honored to be a part of it. Thank you to St. Vincent College. I see some of my faculty and alumni and students there, and the Fred Rogers Center for the support, as well as the University of Mississippi Press, who will launch our book next year for Earth Day. And thank you all for coming and being our neighbors and fellow friends of Fred, especially my kids, Pete and Andy. Hi. Okay, so we want to start the PowerPoint. Our talk today is titled The Green Mr. Rogers, Environmental Wisdom in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So next slide. If you are here, you probably know about Fred Rogers, but I cannot overstate how remarkable he is. So let me offer you this short introduction to Fred and his work. Along with being our local Pittsburgh star, Fred Rogers was an international celebrity. He was a pioneer in children's television, an advocate for families, and a multimedia artist and performer. He wrote the television scripts and the music, performed the puppetry, sang, and hosted almost 900 episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood for more than 30 years. You might already know he earned a bachelor's of music composition at Rollins College, Florida, was ordained a Presbyterian minister from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and studied with Margaret McFarland at the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Child Development. Fred brought all his talent, studies, and ambition to his work for children. As a multimedia artist, Fred's creative endeavors and his imaginative spirit infuse his work with emotional sophistication and deep social and political relevance. He's an innovator in children's media. The quality of his narratives, the fullness of his motifs, the coordination among side plots to spin out different ways to contemplate his theme, the music, the puppets, the personal performance in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood are stunning. So while Roger's work might seem quiet and understated, Jason and I are asking you to look again. His imaginative work is clever and intricate, infused with contagious curiosity and joy. Fred Rogers is a public intellectual, a spiritual leader, and a creative artist. Next slide. So originally airing the week before Sunday, April 22, Earth Day, the 5-episode series from 1990 is entitled, well, we know it as Caring for the Environment. It coalesces with a global initiative celebrating the 20th anniversary of the first Earth Day. The dramas in these Caring for the Environment episodes are rich with conflict and urgency, as well as hope and care. In these episodes, Rogers uses the neighborhood and make-believe segments to dramatize an environmental disaster. The regional dumps are overflowing and trash swiftly accumulates around the neighborhood. Rogers shows neighbors struggling with the crisis and eventually reaching a solution that Jason will tell you about. Rogers reflects on pretend play and discussions and song in his comfortable living room home. He includes field trips to a recycling center, a visit to an artist studio, a visit with a real goat, a visit with oceanographer Sylvia Earle to Florida's Laguna Key coral reefs, all of which we'll explore in this talk. We will address the emotional, imaginative, and real-world components of an ecological wisdom that's appropriate and energizing for children. And now Jason will give us a deep dive into the emotional landscape in Rogers' Caring for the Environment.
Thank you. Yes. One of the things that Sara highlighted that I think is important is the kind of depth that comes along when rewatching Mr. Rogers' show as an adult. As a kid, you were engaged, but then when you go back to adult, you start to see the interconnections, the themes, the sort of social relevance of a lot of his thoughts. And so this week for Caring for the Environment that we've been exploring does this. And the first piece that I wanted to explore is this emotional component that he deals with, and particularly this issue of what we're going to call ecophobia, this kind of fear of environmental disaster that builds up. But to get to that, I want to sort of set the stage, if you will, for Mr. Rogers for the apocalypse, the trash apocalypse on the neighborhood of make-believe during this sort of week. As you can see, Lady Everly is sort of walking through the neighborhood of make-believe, and all of these trash starts to sort of build up all over the place. And it keeps on getting more and more trash. It keeps on getting more and more smelly. And everybody starts to sort of panic and worry in the midst of this. King Friday at one point is going to play with Handyman Negri and makes 200 copies of this one sheet of music and says, oh, just throw it away. And so this kind of casual trash that starts to build up starts to sort of shock everybody that's there. But it becomes so bad, they want to figure out what's going on. And so the first movement in this is they head over to the dump in the neighborhood of make-believe. It's right next to Harriet Cow's school and Don Quixote's farm. And this is a kind of image of it. And here's neighbor Aber and Lady Aveline visiting them to discuss what's going on. It is a pretty interesting setting. As we noted earlier, the kind of social impact from Rogers is oftentimes missed, but as an adult, you can't miss the fact that this has a kind of resonance with Appalachia. Mr. Rogers is from Latrobe, Pennsylvania, where St. Vincent College is, and it's considered to be sort of the northern end of Appalachia with its rolling hills, its cricks and hollers, and you get that terrain captured in this sort of image of the dump. It also, if you were to watch the show, you get the you get the speech that's usually characteristic of that, the accent of Appalachians in Harriet Cow and Don Quixote. However, they start to notice that it's also that the dump is overflowed. It's spilling onto their farm. They've had to close the school because it's not safe for the kids to come there. And this kind of overflow into areas of the country that are impoverished is a common problem, even now with environmentalism, but it's also a chronic historical problem with Appalachia. It's been referred to by author Rebecca Scott in Removing Mountains that Appalachia is sometimes thought of as a sacrifice zone. So people dump waste or dump stuff that they don't need and contaminate the area. They've mined it for trees, they mined it for coal, they've mined it for natural gas. And so not only does Rogers have this trash apocalypse going on in the neighborhood of make-believe, but he also notes how that gets pushed off into faraway lands that people don't sort of think about it. And you can see a little bit then of this sort of urgency now building in the neighborhood of make-believe. It's the land, the neighborhood's filling up, the dump is filling up, the schools are closing, the farming is sort of coming to a halt. And then it gets even sort of worse as the week progresses. Here you have a handyman Negri fanning because it smells so bad in the area. You've got Lady Aberline with a pin on her nose. Cornelius's factory has stopped making rocking chairs and started to make sort of nose plugs so people don't have to smell it. She's approaching X the owl, who's supposed to fly around the area to see if they can find any other dumps to put this in. And this actually sort of ups the ante and the panic at the time period, because they find out that the dump in Westwood is full and the dump in Southwood is also full. And so there's nowhere to take it. But even worse, all of these other areas are also suffering from this same problem. You can start to see, right, this ecophobia building up, especially if you're a child. All the solutions and all the possibilities seem to have disappeared. There's nowhere to take the trash is building up, the neighborhood is well, going to the dumps. And this is what tends to happen to children at times when they're faced with environmental sort of disasters. They seem to be large scale, they seem to be overwhelming. It's stuff like the loss of animal habitats, it's air pollution, it's the polar caps melting. And as children feel like that's so overwhelming because they feel like they can't do anything, they also become sort of apathetic as a kind of protection. And they also sort of fear kind of environmental concerns. This is compounded too when those kind of environmental disasters are mediated through a screen, because then it seems sort of distant and far away, even if it's sort of terrible and coming. If you know Rogers, though, he does not want to leave it with fear. He wants to sort of build it up. So the next piece of this is he starts to show towards the end of the week, people helping. And I would note these quick because we're going to revisit these solutions later on as well in the real world sort of solutions. But Lady Elaine tries a whole series of things. She suggests throwing the trash into the ocean. And they're like, well, maybe the fish might not like that. She's like, well, put it in a plane and fly it away. And they're like, well, where would you land it? She goes, oh, we can send it to just anywhere. And they're like, well, those people might not sort of like it. This image here is Lady Elaine calling her friend Betty from Southwood to see if they can take the trash there. And that's how they find out that the Southwood's also sort of full. And finally, though, Lady Elaine has an idea to go on the Universe Today TV show, which is the upper right-hand corner of the image there. The show is projected across the universe, and they said they can ask people for help there. Below that image is in the background, behind the fax machine, you see Old Goat and New Goat who have come from Northwood to come down and help. And they're using the fax machine to call back to their community to see if they will sort of bring in, see what they can do to help out the neighborhood of make-believe. It is a good point in this that Rogers sees like people helping. And you don't have to be perfect on the first time, but everybody's sort of doing everything that they can to sort of pitch in. So instead of fear, what Rogers is doing is developing hope and possibilities. Not that it's perfect. You don't have to be perfect from the start, but everybody's pitching in, everybody's helping. And so the looming disaster, you have confidence that it will be solved. And with that, Sara will talk about where this sort of leads into our own sort of real world.
Yeah, so thank you for that. The emotional competencies and the emotional issues that Rogers is really wrestling with in this apocalyptic vision are further enhanced and addressed in the imaginative component, where we find that he tries to show us how to recognize an interconnected world. So on the field trip that he takes to see Sylvia Earle, the oceanographer, they're in Laguna, in the coral reef in Florida, and they visit this healthy ecosystem. You know, he never takes students to an actual dump. He doesn't take them to a destroyed ecosystem, but like Jason was saying with in the emotional section, he takes them to a healthy place. One of the things that's interesting about this is the connections that Fred Rogers makes between fish and children. He talks about the schools of fish that harkens back to Harriet Cow's school that's now being overrun by the dump. So we get the feeling that, polluting these ocean habitats, putting your trash into the ocean, and that kind of pollution affects fish in the same way that it affects children. He discreetly talks about how the children and the fish are alike and how this is their home. Something that really connects with the air pollution that the nose muffs were trying to address, which certainly would resonate in Pittsburgh with our infamous smog, is the kind of trying to recognize that this invisible water and this invisible air that we breathe is all connected to each other, and these different ecosystems nourish each other. He talks discreetly about that relationship to our air and the quality of our earth by indexing the quality of the coral reef. In the next slide, after that field trip, he comes home and he shows pictures of these angelfish. And he uses this documentary art and other art throughout the series to try and trigger our memory, to help remind us of that experience with the fish, so that we can keep in mind the connections between that faraway ecosystem and our ecosystem at home. It's a hard thing to kind of imagine that something so far away is so connected to the home aquarium that he has, to our world that we live in. But those kinds of ideas of far away and close, Rogers able to help us imagine. Similarly, in the neighborhood of make-believe, as Jason had mentioned, one of the potential solutions is throwing the trash in the ocean. And you can see neighbor Aber has donned his wetsuit, and he's been checking out the ocean and finds it's too beautiful to put trash there. And it's kind of a hard thing to imagine that the little pieces of trash that children and families have is going to fill up a giant dump. And it's hard to imagine that this great big ocean, that little pieces of trash will pollute it as well. So Fred Rogers is dealing with that near and far, with the big and the small, trying to show us how all of those things that are difficult to imagine are vitally present in our lives. He also looks to other animals to show our interconnected world by looking to goats. So we see that the goats from Northwood they have been dealing successfully with their own trash. And they come to the neighborhood of make-believe, and people suppose, Lady Aberlin here supposes that they might eat all of the trash. Well, good thing we have already learned in Fred's television neighborhood. He has a visit with a real goat, where you learn that goats are actually very discriminating eaters and don't eat trash. So in the neighborhood of make-believe, Rogers asks children to kind of imagine what it would be like if we could listen to that animal wisdom. What would it take to imagine what the fish might say about trash being thrown in their home, and what the goats might say about reusing and recycling? Something that I think is really fun and interesting about these goats, there's old goat and new goat, one of them which speaks English that everyone can understand, but old goat only speaks in bleats. Lady Aberlin, however, is the one human being who can understand this puppet's language. And I think Fred's trying to show us that we can imagine, if we listen and pay attention, what animal wisdom might have to teach us. This kind of interspecies respect and connection, and the multi-ecosystem interdependence and enmeshment is capitalized throughout his entire oeuvre. So, Jason and I kind of looked back at the fun interspecies relationships that actually exist throughout Rogers' work. And we're just touching down for a second into a 1984 Thanksgiving week series on adoption. And we see that there are humans and puppets clothing, there are humanoid puppets, there are animal puppets. This is Mary Owl and X the Owl, who are cousins. Mary Owl is throwing a cousin party, and Bob Dog cannot go because he doesn't have a cousin, but Anna Platypus adopts him. So our platypus and our dog are now cousins. And at the bottom, you can see another adoption has taken place. So throughout his work, Fred has helped establish an interconnected world with interspecies kin. We see it highlighted in Caring for the Environment, but we wanted to point out that that imaginative component is longstanding across many of his episodes. He also, this imaginative component that links a love and respect for the earth, is also connected to the kind of sacred obligations we have to creation and the environment. And we noticed this one with him with the paper towel trees, that's from Caring for the Environment. And in that one, the song Tree, Tree, Tree is instrumentally present when Fred is showing how to reuse household goods and make your own toys and crafts. Well, Tree, Tree, Tree is a celebration, you might recall, of trees. It's one of the most popular songs throughout all the 900 episodes. It's the first song besides the beginning and end song that exists in the very first and the very last episode. It's connected to his own childhood. He sung it to his adopted sister Lainey when she was adopted. He was 11 years old, and he sang it as a lullaby, wrote it for her then. But that celebration of trees is also really connected to imperatives for connecting with people from diverse cultures and languages, and also using recycled instruments. You can see he uses bottles in many of his episodes to play Tree, 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 and is also using homemade instruments. So his interconnected world has with it some motivations for reuse and recycling, which Jason will tell us more about in the next section of the talk.
Thank you. We've been building up these points together. The first one is this sort of both a little bit of fear about the environmental disasters brewing, but mainly hope that things can be done. And that second section helps us to see the world as interconnected, to see things that we sort of care about, and it works our imagination to help us to conceive of that. So that now we've got hope, and now we've got a community of people that we care about that crosses species. And so this last section is, what do we do? How do we sort of act, the real world component? And Rogers often refers to helpers as one of the key things that does it. And so he wants to not only present helpers, but he also wants to help children find ways that they themselves can help. And this is this part of the way he starts to manage the fear from ecophobia is that you can act and do something. But part of that is that also that you don't have to do it all by yourself, that there's people there that help you. And that's the interconnected piece that we're have been speaking about in the first two sections. So in the sort of as the week builds up, Rogers will show a bunch of different people helping in different ways. Early on, they take a trip to the recycling center. You'll see Mr. McFeely bringing, or Mr. Rogers has a bag, he puts the cans in it, and Mr. McFeely says he's going to the recycling center, and they take a kind of field trip there. And Rogers goes and plays, but he also watches the machines compress the cans, compress the sort of newspapers, ask questions about what's going on. And so the children viewer will see not only can adults recycle, but there's a whole company that's sort of committed to recycling that's operative probably in your own neighborhoods. So he shows these, again, what he would refer to as the helpers. And one of his, some of his more public talks, not his sort of show, he will refer to these people as the extraordinary ordinary people, those that are without sort of bright lights or extreme recognition will just do the things that help people along. And so in taking this field trip, he's sort of pointing to one group of people that sort of help, not only the grown-ups by recycling, but the whole recycling center that's processing this. That's one of his helpers. This is echoed back in the neighborhood of make-believe towards the very end of the week. You have Hilda Dingerborder, who sort of comes up with an invention to recycle things. She doesn't tell anyone in the factory. She says, oh, I'm working on a big project. And then you find her on the Universe Today, which is the upper right-hand sort of corner picture, almost surprised. And King Friday, it says, like, do you know where you are? He's not expecting her to be here, but she brings out this machine. And she's sort of she's also echoing that the old goat and new goat will bring help people in the neighborhood to make believe sort their trash to prepare it for recycling. And Hilda's basically developed a machine that will recycle things. She will, and first she puts up a crumpled up piece of paper in there, and it turns it into a paper fan. And then they put the fan back in, and it comes out into like a crowns of the area. So it's a process of recycling that sort of helps to solve the trash apocalypse in the neighborhood of make-believe, but it also has this kind of craft component to it that children might be able to replicate in their own home. And so you get the visit to the recycling center of helpers, and then you get these helpers in the neighborhood of make-believe, these people that are these ordinary people that are sort of solving those problems. Back in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, you have a visit to an artist, Leo Sowell. It's a video that Mr. McFeely sort of brings and shows him. And Leo basically takes all different kinds of objects, what most people would sort of consider trash, and brings them together and sorts them throughout his sort of workshop. You can see in the bottom left-hand sort of corner picture, one of the drawers that Mr. McFeely looks at where he sort of organizes and keeps these sort of different objects. And the current project Leo's working on is the two cats there that are sort of in front of him. But on the wall, you also see another image of a fish. And so Rogers is also, this image of a fish crops up throughout the whole week. The angelfish, the fish in his aquarium, the trip to the coral reef, all of those things try to bring these kind of connections together to remind you of the children in the school, the fish that are part of a school, the fish that are sort of represented in this sort of artwork, and sort of bring them together. And so here's Leo taking things that would be trash and turning them sort of into art. Another sort of moment of recycling, another adult who's sort of helping you sort of in the world. And then this is my favorite part, because like I said, Rogers wants children to know that there's helpers in the world. They don't have to carry everything for themselves, but he also wants to develop children's ability to act and do something and take care of them. So throughout the week, there's a series of little crafts and games that you can play, that he shows children that they can probably pick up and play, that would help them sort of enact a kind of sort of recycling. The first one at the top, he shows this is a bunch of wood blocks that a friend of his sort of made, and he builds it into buildings. And he says on the show, oh, this whole idea with blocks is you can build one building and then you can use the same blocks to build another building. That's recycling right there, using the same thing over to do something else. You can make all sorts of things, that plus your imagination. And so he gets children into this thinking process of, when you think about throwing something away, stop and see if you can sort of reuse that. And it's part of this kind of game, it's part of this imagination, and it's a small act, but it also connects the children's idea of recycling to those bigger projects that are saving the neighborhood of make-believe and saving sort of Rogers' neighborhood. He also, in the right-hand corner, builds a television set with puppets, and he tells kids, you know what, you can sort of do your own shows. And as a matter of fact, you can do your own Mr. Rogers shows. And he sort of encourages us to take the ideas and the narratives of the show and recycle them for themselves. And so they can play their own games. Mr. McFeely will bring a trolley over too, and he will add the trolley to this sort of image. The really interesting one too is also the one in this bottom one. It's a wooden puzzle. And he tells the viewers that this was made from wood that would have been thrown away, and it's been crafted into this complex puzzle with drawers and secret components. And you can pull it, you see him pulling out these kind of nested shelves as it's going through. He said, oh, it's amazing. And to think someone would have thrown away all of this sort of wood, right? And so he turns this around, shows that there's stuff sort of on the inside that can sort of make you think about the world sort of outside. I like that last one too, because at the end of it, he comes back at the end of the show and it's still left on his table. And he says, oh, I can't put it back together. It's just too complicated. I'll have to get someone to help me. And then he says, so I'm going to ask a friend to help me. It's a good feeling that you don't have to solve everything by yourself. You can always ask for help. And there he sort of enables the children to take action and do their own things, but not have the fear or the burden that they have to do sort of everything. He takes that huge ecological disaster that might bring fear and gives you sort of hope. He shows you why you should care in this interconnected world. And here he says, you can do something. You don't have to do everything, but there's lots of people that are, because there's lots of people that are helping, but you can do these little pieces here that are really wonderful and helpful. And so he also, and not only sort of easing the fear of children, he's also empowering them to sort of act in this sort of moment. That brings us to our emotional wisdom that Sarah's going to tie up for us.
Thank you. So our last point is where our book kind of talks about how Rogers connects that emotional, imaginative, and real world concerns together to propose an environmental wisdom for children. I think what Rogers does well is address the hearts, the mind, and the hands, and the wisdom that he models. It activates hindsight, it sharpens foresight, it deepens insight, to give us a different perspective, a perspective that's really wise. He does this by bringing one of the ways he does this is by bringing the literal and the figurative together. And I have a fun example of that for you here. During his 1990s week on caring for the environment, he actually has a flashback, an embedded scene, a memory that he has of 1972 when he went to visit Mrs. McFeely, and she showed him her homemade recycled crafts. You can see a bird feeder made out of a milk carton with peanut butter in it and bird seed, and a rug that was made out of old clothes. He puts inside of the 1990 episode, he has this memory, and we go back to 1972. It's an authentic clip. And you can see that he's, recycling. He talks after that moment about how memories can be recycled, right? So that's like literally talking about recycling, but figuratively talking about recycling your memories, remembering your values, remembering who you are, remembering the people in your lives that have loved you into becoming who you are. The 1972 episode, that was before he started doing these themed weeks, but it's a 2-episode storyline of the neighborhood of make-believe. It's also about pollution. And if you want to know more, I'll tell you more about it in the Q&A. But the way he kind of figuratively and literally talks about recycling and uses his own previous episodes, I think is a fun, wise thing for him to enact for children. And finally, Fred's environmental wisdom is really attuned to children. And that's something really curious and powerful that we noticed in caring for the environment, is that there really aren't any of the child puppets present. I mean, we know that the school has been closed while Harriet Cow helps to fortify the dump so it doesn't spill over into the school and the farm. But it's really unusual that Daniel Tiger is not present in these episodes. So like Jason was saying about ecophobia, I mean, the fear of your own home environment, the fear of the pollution, the fear of catastrophes in your own, environmental habitat. Ecophobia is really powerful and an alienating force. And I can really imagine Daniel Tiger, his sensitive soul, being overwhelmed by that. And so I think that, Fred was really wise to keep him out of that episode. It's caring for the environment is a little bit unusual that there's no child puppets in it. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, it's all designed for shared viewing with children and their caretakers watching together. But Fred's own wisdom about children's inner lives, how to help them grow with a deep-seated love for creation is something that we can have the wisdom to continue to learn from today. So thank you for listening to our talk, and we welcome any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah and Jason. And as Sarah said, the floor is now open for questions. You can ask, you can communicate in 3 different ways, actually. If you want to ask a question that I can read to the panelists, type that into the Q&A. If you have a comment or a remark that you'd like to share with everybody else, type that into the chat. And I also see that I'm able to enable individual people to talk. And so if you'd like to actually ask your question directly, raise your hand and I can arrange that. So while questions are coming in, I will begin. So I'd love it if either of you could set Mr. Rogers's environmental episodes in the context of American church history. So in the 21st century, care for the earth is a very prominent theme in American Christianity. Evangelical leaders like Rick Warren have written prominently about this. We have a papal encyclical on care for the environment. But what was the context like in, say, 1990, and what were Mr. Rogers' sources and inspirations, Christian sources and inspirations for this kind of intervention?
That's probably me, since I'm the theologian, but Sarah is free to sort of jump in there as well. It is, the context is, you've had Earth Day, but it's about ready to go international. And so he sort of targets and plans that week for it. It is interesting. In the text, we do a comparison of Laudato Si, the Pope Francis's encyclical, and Mr. Rogers. And it's almost easier to look forward from Rogers than to look at some of his sources. There's not a lot of resources about him talking about the theology that informs his show. You can find it in a few interviews. There's a few sermons, the Fred Rogers archives. I've dug into those things a little bit, and he does clearly have a sense of the fact that love is expansive and it continues to include others. He has a belief very early on too that about not eating meat. He doesn't feel like he could eat something with a mother, and so he takes a very what year was that, Sarah? Was that like it was very early on that he became a vegetarian and sort of funded vegetarian, or a vegetarian a magazine and signed sort of petitions against sort of the use of fur. And he really saw that as this kind of expansive sense that this is all part of God's creation. And if you are not kind, even to your animals, your animal kin, and that this was a problem for him. And so he saw that, I think, sort of coming out of that pieces. But I say it's almost easier to look forward, because with Laudato Si, you see these kinds of things that Rogers talked about nascently, really sort of in Rogers, echoed in Pope Francis's Laudato Si. The idea of an ecological conversion, of being able to sort of shift your mindset from you being sort of the center of the universe to you being part of a kind of environment that's there. Pope Francis's line, everything is connected. This is Rogers keeps on sort of building these bridges between what the adults are doing and the kids are doing, the neighborhood make-believe, the neighborhood, his television sort of neighborhood, those things, that interconnectedness is something he really started to sort of anticipate. And the other thing that I think that was sort of foreshadowed, or at least connects to sort of Laudato Si, is there's needs to be big efforts for change in the environment, but also there's a kind of spirituality, kind of actions that we need to take in our own daily lives that are really sort of important now, not only for the environment, but also as we sort of grow and develop, so that we can take on those bigger sort of pieces. So you have a little bit of his Christianity, that kind of expansive notion of love, that we care for our neighbors and strangers, including animals in that. And then, but also I think it's easier to see him going forward with the interconnectedness that we have in creation.
Super, thanks. And then we have a question from the floor from John Allen, who should be able to speak now.
Can you hear me?
Yes. We can.
Okay. Great. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. King and Dr. Lindey. I think the work you're doing is important for engaging young people with social problems like climate change and stewardship for the earth. I was curious, though, about what you thought of Rogers' choice to circumvent the apocalyptic approach, especially in the face of pressing effects that that climate change is bringing. Like, for example, I think fostering children's individual agency in relation to the natural world is, it's and doing that in a way that's safe and emotionally hopeful is a great, admirable impulse. But I guess the lingering question for me remains in that, how do you translate this individual care and concern for nature into tangible policy action when young people grow up, right? Is something else needed to mediate the work of Rogers, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it does seem like this week is bifurcated into two different lessons. Adults, you need to start recycling. We need to be involved in this. But the lessons for children and the kind of wisdom that he wants children to gain, I think, is really an attitude and a love of creation, so that when they grow up, it won't even be a question. How much should we pollute? Should we pay the fine? Or should we, what should we do about that when you're making the calculus for your business? Those kind of questions won't even, come up. So I think when he's starting with, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, that kind of instilling those memories of their values, so that it's a kind of an ingrained wisdom and perspective, that there's a paradigm shift for how we are connected to and think about and therefore interact with our environment. So I think what's appropriate about letting the trash apocalypse, and Jason, you'll probably want to say more about this, reveal the truth of our relationships to each other and to the natural world, the changes that come about in our hearts and our minds, and what our hands should do is kind of natural, but shouldn't be burdened with children. What he does in the 1972 episode that's so different, when the waterway is polluted from the factory, from Cornelius's rocket factory. That's the big environmental problem of that episode. And it gets solved the pollution, the dye from the factory that's polluted all the waterfall and the waterways. It gets solved when Lady Elaine uses her magic boomerang toomerang to suck the dye and put it back in the bottle. And in that 1972 episode, when they return from the neighborhood of make-believe, Roger says, well, you know, that's not how it works in real life. You know, in real life, we have to solve these problems ourselves. And that's actually what they did in the 1990s episodes. I know it's crazy to like take a spaceship to an intergalactic show to realize that your neighbor has made a recycling machine and the goats are going to help you sort trash. So still kind of fantastic, but it's a solution where people come together. It's not that magic boomerang. So those are kind of the two things I wanted to say about that. But Jason, you probably.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks, John. And I will say, like, we did use the language of apocalyptic. Both Sarah and I used it sort of intentionally, because it's not apocalyptic in the kind of popular sense of like everything's going to end and it's all doom and gloom, but really in a biblical sense of the apocalypse is a kind of critique against a culture that's sort of distorted and not following God's ways. And an apocalypse happens to reorient that and to undo those kind of evil forces and sort of bring creation closer to sort of God's will. And I think that sort of captures Roger's sort of twofold approach that Sarah was highlighting, which is on the one hand, he has a kind of demand placed upon adults who should be watching the show, but also if you do follow or if you paid attention to Roger's public sort of talks, he sort of demands and sort of calls adults to sort of task that you need to get on these kinds of things. And the other piece of that is to sort of engender in children a love for creation, such that then when they are a love and a wisdom, such that when they are grown, that they will be able to solve these sort of problems. So it's a little bit more of a spirituality than a policy sort of piece. And I would not sort of say the only thing that needs to happen is Rogers, but that he's got that sort of that demanding piece with like things need to change now, but also this kind of hopeful piece that like, let's raise our children with love and wisdom and they can sort of fix it. They will continue on this sort of trajectory of helping us out in the future.
Susan asks, or it's more like a comment, maybe you can comment on this. Susan says, it seems like his thematic presentations of the deep interconnections of content and the style of teaching should be recomposed as a technique to help teachers of pre-K through grade 2 teachers to develop the same content for the classroom. The sheer simplicity and depth of it. Teachers would benefit from intense guided explorations of how to apply what he did in a week, such as this, into the classroom their way.
Yeah, I would urge you, Susan, if you haven't already, to connect with the Educators Neighborhood Network. The Fred Rogers Center has a program. They have an event later in March. They've been showing kindergarten and early elementary school teachers have been showing Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in the classroom, and then talking about how that's been going and what they've been learning about it. And that would be a community that I think you would love to be a part of. I always learn so much when I attend their sessions. So the Fred Rogers Center is doing great work with that organization. If you go to the Fred Rogers Center page, you should be able to navigate to that group and register for their next session.
Yeah, and just to add to that, right across from the Fred Rogers Center on campus is the Winnie Palmer Nature Reserve. Arnold Palmer's wife is named in honor of her. And Angela Belli runs this, and it's an educational center for young kids. And they've got these paths and these trails, and especially during the spring and the fall when things are open. She has kids there. They'll do like an introductory lesson. They'll go out to the field to sort of explore. They'll come back and sort of do a craft. And it looks very similar to the kinds of stuff that Rogers did. That's both touching on like things that you can do. It addresses the big picture, but it also is a kind of like get people to see and connect with things, and that sort of builds up sort of over time. So yeah, I hope so too. I think there's a lot of potential in here of how you would sort of move through both the fear and the hope, the kind of near and the far, and the helper and sort of also being someone who can help yourself. So.
I'm interested in the technology in the Trash Apocalypse episode. It seems like modern communications technology, at least, is one of the sources of hope. We have the telephone. There's the galactic television station, the fax machine.
Yeah.
What do you see going on there? And are there other treatments of technology throughout the show's treatment of environmentalism?
Yeah, and to add to that, you saw the television show that he encourages children to make and put on their own puppet show inside that television show. So the way that I think Fred imagines communication technology being able to bring us together, even when it's a broadcast technology, even if it's like the Zoom technology, that's one of the virtues of technology, is to use at the service of people, to bring people together so that they can solve problems. A machine on its own can't do anything. But if the trolley can take us between worlds, if the purple jet can take us to the television station, if the boat can take us to the coral reef, so I think he does a lot with transportation technology and with communication technology to bring people and ecosystems together. But he also grounds children in the domestic space. So you can watch these videos to learn about the coral reef. And I hope your family goes on vacation, but there are all these ways that we can use communication technology to give us this window into these worlds while remaining safe in our home with our family, being cared for. So it's a really, and all the solutions are right at home in the very neighborhood that you come from. So he says that too in letters that children write and that grown-ups write to him. He'll say, when they write with problems, he'll write back, with his love, and says, look to the grown-ups around you. I'm your television neighbor. Look to the grown-ups around you and find someone who can help you. So this connection of near and far, and the reality of the very people in our homes also seems to be highlighted even as we connect far away. Does that make sense?
Love that. Yes.
Yeah, he also, at the very early on in his career, like that was one of his reasons why he went into television, is he thought there's great potential here and it wasn't being used in the way that he thought it should be used. And so he does have this kind of sense of technology, is that it can be really helpful, but you also have to make sure you're guiding it in ways that's sort of useful. And so he was intentionally trying to move away from, he has this line about like people throwing pies in each other's faces, and that's what he doesn't want to do when he wants to offer something that's more constructive and building that up. So.
Alex Bilyak asks, it seems that in our education system, we teach about climate change and environmental issues when children are far too young to understand all of the nuances of the problem, but then stop discussing it nearly as much when they get to the age where they can understand the full extent of it. How can we go about rectifying this issue in our educational system and in popular media as a whole?
That's a great question. I
just really want to know also.
yeah. So I don't know if I have a solution. I think Rogers, for me, what Rogers does is that the show is targeted to younger children, and that he starts to deal with those emotional sort of pieces and emotional management. How do you deal with those things, acknowledging them, affirming them, but also finding constructive ways to sort of deal with that. And I think that's probably the better approach for the younger children, so that they don't, like the technical stuff or the fear or the overwhelming pieces don't get to you. We do have a kind of gap in the middle, and that's something that needs to be sort of fixed. I see maybe hope at college levels, more classes, and maybe it's the flexibility of the curriculum allows more of that to sort of be included in that and discussed both in classes on their own, but also like intersecting with other subjects sort of around. So there's a green literature class on campus, there's green theology, there's environmental studies, so there's a bunch of ways I think you can see that. But the high school, middle school level, I'm less knowledgeable about how you would sort of make those sort of maneuvers. And I can only speak for my own kids that they got great teachers and they're good kids, but the curriculum seems very externally determined. So they find, I feel like the teachers are always trying to find space and room in there to sort of do that. So you'd have to find a much more communal effort, I think, if you wanted to address that at the high school. But again, that's like 2 cents.
Well, something that Fred does well that I would like, that I think we should be able to scale across all levels of educational enterprises is the entanglement of the network and the system. So the way that he can show so many dimensions with the literal and the figurative and the symbolic, the way that he can speak on so many levels. So it seems to me like when I butt up against, here's an idea, a solution or an idea I have about an environmental intervention, it's hard for me to understand the full system. Okay, well, can you transport that energy? Or wait, what are the costs of that, right? But the recognition of that network, the entanglement and the system, I think will help open our minds for when we don't know and how to imagine the various ways that our problems are complex and need to be addressed multidimensionally on so many levels. But while we're looking at like the interconnected ecosystems, technologies, people, animal, machine, cyborg, the foundation for the ethical relationships, he can also teach us about that through his spirituality and his emphasis on the emotional and spiritual connection is just as real as the pollution and the material connection. I feel like that's kind of a weird imaginative answer. And I don't know if that means we have to deal in metaphors and problem posing and project-based inquiry. But the complexity that he entertains while looking at, reclaimed wood that becomes a puzzle, but the insides multiply when he takes them out and he can't fit them back in. Like, wow, okay, so the inside is like bigger than the outside. Like, it actually is, but it like fits in the out, like, so he presents these kinds of puzzles that you can address on multiple layers with children, and really I think with grown-ups that get at like a spiritual and a practical truth.
That's fantastic. So I think we can take one more question, but to acknowledge that some people will have to leave at 8, I just want to give a practical comment, which is that this entire event will be made available within the next 48 hours on Beatrice Institute's YouTube page if you'd like to share it with others. And I want to call attention to this beautiful chat comment from Carrie Kokenauer, maybe that's how you pronounce it, who former student of yours, which is just a testimony to the great work that you're doing at St. Vincent College.
I think actually John Allen, who asked the first question, is also an alum of St. Vincent's College too. So.
All right, great. All right. Okay, so last question. Climate change has been transformed into a political issue, which makes it difficult for people in society to come together and devise solutions, like in Rogers' neighborhood. What do you see as the best way to work across the political aisle regarding climate change? And that's from John Blount.
That's a good one. I've been doing some subsequent work on Mr. Rogers on really some of his deeper, he doesn't have a lot, but he has a few theological sort of writings to sort of get at that. And he really, and Sara has even a broader knowledge of sort of Rogers, but so she might be able to add to this too, but Rogers sees so many of these problems is having to do with the human heart, as having to do with the fact that we are creatures that want to love and to be loved. And when he was a child, he was picked on for being fat. And that's a moment where you could really turn in on yourself, and that not having that need to be loved met could really turn you sort of angry and hostile. And Rogers instead took that and became more empathetic and sort of set himself on a life of trying to sort of overcome that and sort of address that. So when you see, I think that Rogers would see this kind of division that we have politically as definitely social, political, economic, all of those factors playing in, but it's also spinning out from a deeper need of human beings to be loved and accepted. He would not tolerate cruelty, and he wouldn't tolerate people being pushovers. He was actually, Junlei Lee, who used to work here and is now sort of at Harvard, used to refer to Mr. Rogers as steely, a steely look. And so he's not a pushover. And so he would stand up, but nor would he sort of escalate in terms of sort of violence or aggression, right? He would sort of meet people and sort of say, we will not sort of do what's wrong, but he would also try very hard not to vilify people and find avenues by which that he could sort of affirm their sort of dignity, even in the midst of sort of a disagreement. And it's a hard space to negotiate of trying to sort of stop people that might be sort of doing harm, and still sort of respecting them. But in those moments where you've got people of different opinions that ostensibly could negotiate, then that mutual respect, I think that Rogers would sort of push for. It becomes that kind of foundation that if you could build up that trust, then you have a better chance of sort of doing the kind of rough and tumble discussions to actually sort of get somewhere. So I don't know. I find a lot of that pretty compelling, but it is an intractable problem that Rogers, I think, sort of saw maybe taking the course of a few lifespans to sort of work its way out. I don't know, Sarah.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jason, that he had these ideas that you don't want to be the accuser, you want to be the advocate. So you have that in your heart and mind when you engage in conversations. But I also think about his celebration, his like contagious joy for creation, and this real value in our natural world and ourselves as part and parcel of that natural world. So I know it probably sounds like a postcard, but he really, worked hard to make goodness attractive and to show the joy and enthusiasm, to celebrate our rivers and streams and mountains and each other. And so I think whenever you can, bring joy to creation, that and celebrate that, it's a little bit of an antidote to the rancor.
Yeah. And I'll add this, I was just thinking about it too, is I think maybe one of Rogers' strategies is that if you get the children believing in it and 20 to 30 years, then that resolves itself because all the kids are on board together. They're grown-ups now and they all have that same sort of view. So maybe he's got a long-term also strategy of addressing those issues.
I do think he hopes that we remain connected to our childhood selves. If we can find something really nourishing and beautiful, if we can remember how Fred feels about us when we're children, if we can be reconnected to those memories, then that'll give us a kind of inner strength to be able to combat a world that insists on division and lies at times.
Well, thank you. This conversation has been a source of joy, and so your book is forthcoming. Unfortunately, not this coming Earth Day, right?
Right.
Delayed by COVID, but even though you're all ready to go with it, but the following Earth Day in 2022.
Yes,
that's correct. Yeah.
Good. Well, we will all be looking out for that, and thank you very much, both of you, for not only for making the time, but really for crossing disciplines. And it's a great sign of intellectual friendship that you've put together this book, and this presentation is so seamless. It's hard to tell which of you wrote which parts, even though you were trading back and forth. So that was really, really lovely.
Thank you for the invitation. It was fun to talk. Yeah.
And thank you to all of our audience members.
Yes, thank you all for showing up.
Yeah, and this conversations like this, as Sara Lindey so graciously noted at the beginning, continue on the Beatrice Institute podcast and on the YouTube channel. And so please check back in for more good conversations like this in the future. All right, thank you everybody and good night.
Thank you.